One. All right, good morning. I am here with Professor James McGrath of Butler University. He will be talking to me today about the doctrine of the Ascension in Christian theology, and we'll get more into that, but it is the basic sense that after Jesus' resurrection, he was brought into the heavenly realm or taken to be with God in some way. And in a minute, I'll get into some of the questions, but I'd just like to introduce Professor McGrath here. James F. McGrath is the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature. His PhD from the University of Durham became the basis for his first book, John's Apologetic Christology, published by Cambridge University Press in the SNTS monograph series. He has also written a prequel about the broader context of monotheism and Christology in ancient Judaism and Christianity, titled The Only True God, Early Christian Monotheism in its Jewish Context, published by the University of Illinois Press. In addition to his work on the New Testament and early Christianity, Dr. McGrath also researches the Mandaeans, which, by the way, we definitely need to do a follow-up video on the Mandaeans at some point. The last surviving Gnostic group from the ancient world and their literature. The two-volume critical edition, translation, and commentary on the Mandaean Book of John, which he produced together with Charles Haberl of Rutgers University, represents the first such academic edition of the complete work in English based on all known manuscripts. Another area of specialty is the intersection of religion and science fiction. On that subject, he is the author of Theology and Science Fiction, editor of Religion and Science Fiction, and co-editor of Time and Relative Dimensions in Faith, Religion, and Doctor Who. He blogs at Religion Prof, which I will link on my blog after I post this video. Professor McGrath, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the Ascension. Now, this is primarily, these videos are being made for my students because my students now are having to learn everything online. And I wanted to mix in some expertise. So I've been interviewing various scholars about topics, and I'm so grateful that you were willing to join me to talk about the doctrine of the Ascension, which my students will be reading about next week. But can you explain to my students why I'm talking to you about this subject? In other words, what's the focus of your research and your academic career?
So I asked myself the same question. Why is he talking to me about this? I guess I could tell. Should I let them know that the short answer is you asked on Facebook who's interested? And I said, me, include me, please. But my academic background intersects with this topic through almost all of the areas, if not indeed all of the areas that you mentioned, as well as some other side interests. From the bio that you read off of the Butler website, I think your students and anyone else who's listening to this will get the sense that I'm easily distracted by new and interesting topics.
Right.
But I always try and find ways of connecting them. And it's interesting, one way one could connect them is actually the Ascension. There is no depiction of Jesus rising up into the air in the Gospel of John, which was my focus in my doctoral work, but it was on the depiction of Jesus, the Christology, to use the technical term, of the Gospel of John, and how that relates to other early Christian literature. And one major theme in the Gospel of John is the terminology that's used in the Gospel of John is that Jesus will be lifted up. Mm-hmm. And that language sometimes seems to denote exaltation, sometimes seems to denote crucifixion, and very often seems to have resonances of all of those combined into one, as though John is sort of punning and playing on the multifaceted meaning of that term.
Right.
And so one can ask, where's the Ascension in John? Is it there but not narrated literally just because of where that gospel ends? Is it an assumption? Is it alluded to? As I explored the broader question of early Christology and how Jesus is thought of in other New Testament works, the depiction of Jesus in Luke and Acts has always fascinated me. But thinking about Paul as well, right? There's that famous passage that might actually be Paul alluding to a pre-Philippians, pre the writing of Philippians,
right,
hymn or poem, in which he talks about how God, because of Jesus' obedience unto death, God highly exalted him, giving him the name above every name. Is that the Ascension in so many words? And so how this also relates to how these authors think about Jesus and who he is and why he matters. And so it connects with where I started in a lot of ways. I'm also interested, as somebody who's involved in the life of a church as well as an academic career focusing on these things, uh, interested in the practical ramifications and what people do with these things. And if one were to survey what popular opinion is about the afterlife,
Right.
they might affirm that Jesus rose, they might say he ascended, but if you ask them, what does that mean for you? I'm going to heaven when I die.
Right. Right.
And so is this a bodily ascension, or is this an ascension like everyone else? Or is this, that people are expecting? How do those relate to one another? And so there's that facet. And that, of course, could even connect with my interest in the Mandaeans and Gnosticism, which was focused on ascension, but leaving the body behind, ideally,
Right.
and leaving this entire negative material world. And so the potential physicality or otherwise of ascension connects with not just questions of hope for the afterlife and beliefs about the afterlife, but also the valuing or denigration of material existence, of creation, and things like that. And then, of course, you can connect it with science fiction and science as well. How does this relate to cosmology?
Right.
Should people be looking for the ascended Jesus or the returning Jesus through a telescope?
Right.
If we can achieve warp drive, can we catch up with Jesus? Or do we assume that he's already reached that speed and so is going faster than we could? I mean, what is,
Right.
all those kinds of questions I think are worth bringing into the picture, not to be facetious, not to be irreverent, not that there's anything wrong with that from time to time. Sometimes a little bit of irreverence shows where we are sensitive, sometimes in ways because we're uncomfortable, because we haven't thought about things.
Right.
But I think the question of how this relates to the way we view the universe today is crucially important as well.
I agree. It's interesting because in a different class of mine this week, they're studying Scientology. And I imagine that for a lot of my students, they're going to go, oh, this is so weird and so strange. And one of the things I said to them in their instruction video is take your time and be cautious as you engage the otherness of this religion, because you got to remember 2 millennia ago, people were hearing things that are now considered to be kind of commonplace about Christianity. And they were thinking, what madness is this? And so give a religion enough time and what was once madness becomes generally accepted ideas. But if you really go back and look at Christianity and you dig into it, you go, hey, some of this stuff that I've kind of just assumed its truthfulness and I've taken in, I've heard it a million times. If I really think about it, yeah, this is a little bit strange in some sense. This week, my students will be reading the resurrection narratives in the canonical Gospels, and they're going to notice that only the Gospel of Luke at the end, after Jesus resurrects, explicitly narrates what we might call an ascension. Though, as you mentioned, there might be a sense in some of the Gospels that Jesus is going somewhere. Why is this that only Luke is the one who talks specifically about the ascension as Christians have come to understand it?
That's a great question. And I think one could either read a lot into it or relatively little.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, Luke does some very interesting things right at the end of his gospel that make for a natural segue into the beginning of Acts, but also raise questions about how his depiction relates to what you find in other gospels. Mm-hmm. Right? Go to Galilee, you'll see me there, versus remain in Jerusalem until you receive power from on high.
Right.
And of course, even if Matthew's gospel were to presuppose that there's an ascension immediately following its Great Commission ending,
right,
it's happening in Galilee rather than in Jerusalem. And so how does that affect things?
Right.
And so I think one possible answer, because I came through a fairly conservative religious tradition at one point that led me to avoid seeing any contradictions in things or any tensions. Everything should get along just fine. Right. One reason why I pursued this area, this field of study, was precisely to make sense of the fact that, no, there are some things in there that don't seem to fit. How do I make sense of this?
Right.
But I think we can also go too far to the other extreme in seeing divergence. Mm-hmm. I think that what a lot of the New Testament authors were doing was narrating, the gospel authors were narrating things that they probably received as essentially a sort of a creedal affirmation. Mm-hmm. So if we look at something like, Paul's account of the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, right? It's a list of people that Jesus appeared to, no geographical setting, nothing, very specific. And so you could easily see somebody trying to turn that tradition they inherited into a narrative, tell the story about that, and making assumptions. And then suddenly you have contradiction where in fact, maybe they actually reflect the same exact tradition, just fleshing out the details in different ways.
Right.
And so I think that's something to consider, right? Is Luke simply telling of an ascension because he's continuing the story? And if so, then really that's just a clue to something that's maybe the biggest clue to what Luke was focused on, which is he continues into a second volume.
Right.
Other gospel authors don't do that.
Right.
And I think that connects with the broader theme, because towards the end of the Gospel of Luke, where Matthew and Mark have Jesus talking about signs that the end is near, essentially. For Luke, it's the false prophets who come and who deceive people will say, not just I am he, as the other Gospels have it, but also the time is near, right? And so Luke is writing for a sort of a longer haul.
Right.
And so thinking about Jesus as present through the Spirit, but absent in another way, I think ties in with a major theme. But I think some of it may just be that Luke is narrating something that many of the New Testament authors, maybe all of the New Testament authors, assumed, which was that Jesus went to be at the right hand of God, and that involves what we would call ascension.
Right. Now, speaking of the first century, if I were living in the first century and I was told that the Messiah had gone to be with the Father, but he would return at some point, and that when he had gone to be with the Father, he ascended into the sky, how would I have understood this?
Right.
Would I have thought he went into the sky literally? Would I have understood this to be a metaphor? What would I be thinking if I were a first century person about this story?
And I think that's a great question. It's a crucially important one. There are lots of debates in our time about literalism, and you'll hear certain people sometimes even refer to themselves as biblical literalists or Bible-believing Christians or something like that. And all you have to do is look at another major theme in Luke, another major teaching. Luke is fairly specific in articulating Jesus challenging disciples, saying, none of you can be my follower unless he gives up all he possesses.
Right.
Oh, watch biblical literalism go out the window, even for so-called biblical literalism. But when it comes to things like cosmology, right, our view of the universe, that's one of those places where there are usually shades of things. There was somebody who actually was killed not that long ago trying to launch himself into the sky in a rocket, who believed a flat Earth.
Flat Earth, right, yeah.
And so there are some people who are more literalists than even, say, the young Earth creationists.
Right.
But even then you have, the very fact that you're making a rocket and trying to do this, you're aware of gravity. There are other things, you're not just looking for angels to catch you up or something, doing it the old fashioned way if you're going to try an ascension.
Right.
If we read ancient literature, these were things that people took literally. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people today would say, don't take it literally, but are we then believing something different, understanding something different than the ancient authors did? Right. And I think that's actually a crucially important topic.
Yeah.
There was a New Testament scholar very active in the 20th century named Rudolf Bultmann. He's sometimes spoken about dismissively in conservative circles, sometimes neglected in others. A lot of his source critical work and other things has not stood the test of time in all its details. Right. Sometimes pick too many things apart in too many specifics.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the theological approach to the New Testament, he at the very least raised what I think are still crucially important questions. Mm-hmm. Right? And one of his fundamental beliefs was that it has to be possible for people to be confronted with the gospel today and become Christians today without having to accept a first century worldview. Right. That is very different from our own. Right. And even if your solution is different than Bultmann's demythologization program, right, he was asking the right questions. And I think a lot of people are avoiding those questions. And so I think these are questions we need to ask. And for Paul, he talked about being caught up to the third heaven, right? Right. And he seems to have meant that literally. Yeah. In Acts, we have Jesus ascending from the Mount of Olives, which you'll see behind me, right? So, it seemed like an appropriate backdrop for a conversation on this topic.
Right.
Does that mean that if we can calculate the direction that the Mount of Olives was pointing and the correct day, then we have the direction where the throne of God is, if you just look upwards far enough?
Right.
And so there are all these questions that arise at the intersection between the ancient worldview and our own. I studied at the University of Durham with James Dunn, and he wrote the article on mythology for the IVP Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels, the first edition of that. They dropped the article on mythology, I think, for the second edition, as I recall. But in that, he said something to the effect that to demythologize the Ascension is not to deny that Jesus in some sense went to heaven, right, to be with God, but to take it out of the domain of present and future space research.
Right.
So if you don't think this is a question for NASA, then whether consciously or not, you have altered, you've altered things vis-a-vis the viewpoint and the worldview of the New Testament authors. And even the fact that you're thinking about NASA and a Milky Way galaxy and things like that, and how far does Jesus get and how fast do you have to go to get, these questions did not arise for ancient people.
Right.
And I think that's okay, right? If we take another image from the New Testament, the image of, the heart as the place where people think, ancient people thought of that literally, right? Aristotle thought that that was the place of cognition.
Right.
And so when Paul used that language, he probably was not thinking it's a metaphor.
Right.
He probably didn't worry about whether it was a metaphor or not, but he probably assumed it was literal. People did. We take it as a metaphor and we manage to make sense of it.
Right.
The Ascension might be a little bit more complicated when it comes to that, but we do that in so many things that relate to biblical language that we shouldn't be afraid of at least broaching the topic when it comes to the Ascension.
Right. So let's get then, I think we'll come back to how modern people should think about it in just a couple questions, but I want to think over the span of church history then. Let's go from the first century through the 2 millennia. What purpose did the doctrine of the Ascension serve the early Christians and their proclamation of the gospel? In other words, what's the point? Why say that Jesus went somewhere or to be with God, or why? What's the big deal?
Yes, I think that the Ascension, not in the narrow sense of Luke describing it as Jesus lifting up into the sky until clouds hide him, but the Ascension in the sense of Jesus being exalted to the right hand of God the Father, right, becomes one of the major tenets of the earliest creeds, right? Even before there is an explicit doctrine of the Trinity as part of a creedal affirmation, that Jesus, ascended, is seated at the right hand of the Father, it will come again in glory. It was about his status. It was about God vindicating him beyond death. Right. And so there's a connection with resurrection, in a sense. Resurrection is also about that, God undoing the execution of his anointed one.
Right.
But simply being brought back to life, even if it's life of a different sort, the life of the age to come, doesn't make the point quite as clearly as being seated at the right hand of the Father, the right hand of the Majesty in heaven, this kind of language. And that place to be seated was in fact connected with the Davidic king, understood as the Lord's anointed, the one that God has appointed to rule over the nations. And really they're taking that language and cranking it up a notch, right, to say that Jesus is exalted above the heavens, above every power on earth or in the sky, literally. Right. And the message of that is that this human being is elevated to the status that human beings were supposed to have over against creation. And so living in a world in which the sky was thought to be a realm of multiple heavens, of powers that at the very least did not have human beings' best interests at heart. Right. Right? You have the sun, moon, and planets, which are thought to sort of rule over people's destiny, but also, they're worshipped by the nations, and are these false gods and all these kinds of things. Right. Are they mere parts of creation? But they're certainly angelic beings, some of whom are not on our side, as it were.
Right.
And Jesus is depicted as being exalted above all of these powers.
Right.
And I think that's sort of the heart of that message of the ascension for the ancient church and for the church down the ages.
Right. Very good. So let's now come back to our present time. As modern people, as we've talked about, our cosmology is very, very different from that of the ancients. In your opinion, how should modern Christians understand the doctrine of the ascension now that most of us aren't going to be flat earthers, and we realize that the cosmos are far more complicated than the ancients understood? Does this doctrine have any worth for people today?
Should I just say yes or no? Leave it at that. It's like, I think as an academic, the really interesting thing is, of course, the question and the fact that people answer it in different ways.
Right.
And to be honest, I'm not sure that I have a one-size-fits-all answer that I'm comfortable giving.
Right.
I think, though, that understanding the ascension as a literal move up into the sky to go to some place that, is it to meet the new Jerusalem that's depicted in the book of Revelation, which is already en route, which will descend from the sky like a giant Borg cube, to use a metaphor from another area that I work in sometimes. Is that the right way to understand this? And, if so, you just need to add irresistible grace, and then you can make a great meme with a New Jerusalem Borg cube that says, resistance is futile, you will be assimilated into the New Jerusalem, or something like that. I've been thinking about making that meme as I've been thinking about this conversation.
I think it needs to be created now.
Yeah, you might have to do that.
Yeah.
But for me, I think that the key question is, in our different contexts, can we encapsulate, can we convey, can we reformulate any of those key ideas in a way that still makes sense for us, right? So what's the dignity of human beings in the purpose of God within not just a broader universe with galaxies and maybe other inhabited planets, but within an evolutionary framework, within just the realm of science more generally? How does that fit into things? Is the place of Jesus one that is supposed to be understood as unique, or is he traveling on a route that we're all supposed to follow, right? Through bodily resurrection, right? Through entrance into the presence of God. Right. And from the Gnostics to what became Orthodoxy across a wide array of divergences in both, Jesus was either simply kind of a paradigm that we're to follow, but with or without him, you can do it too, kind of thing. Right. To Jesus is unique, and don't you dare try this at home. But for the most part, I think the New Testament authors thought of Jesus as one who is leading the way. Right. He goes ahead of us, he goes before us. And so I think ultimately the question is, what does this have to do with, and how do people get in contact with God in the present day, right? And I think that if we're focused on that question, some of the details and how you fit into your cosmology, or whether you set it aside. And I think we really do need to recognize that sometimes Christians have said, this doesn't fit our worldview. Right. There's no way to make sense of this within the world as we understand it. We need to think about this differently. Right. But even when we do that, there's a danger that we'll lose things, right? So if you say, well, we tend not to think of a physical cosmos, a physical heaven above us that we'll go to with material bodies, and so we'll just ditch the whole idea of bodily resurrection. Right. Well, sometimes along with that, we denigrate the material world, we do other things, we have a negative view of creation. And so whether we keep something like the ascension, whether we demythologize it and say, Jesus is with God, right? And that's a different plane of existence, not a real place. Right. Whether you say something else. Right. I think the key thing is to think seriously about making sense of it within our own context, but also think about what we might be losing in rephrasing and reformulating. That's a great answer. And it ties in closely with my next question, which is going to be kind of complicated as well. In the same way, it might have a similar feel to it. The Ascension seems to connect closely with another doctrine that my students are going to encounter soon. That's the Parousia, or the second coming or second appearing of Jesus.
what's the connection between these two doctrines in Christian thought?
I think they're closely connected. And I think that that gives us a reason why the doctrine of the Ascension is potentially important, because even for those who are not particularly focused in, not aware that there might be any debates about Jesus going up into the sky and how literally or otherwise to interpret that he will come back from the sky is important. In certain circles, the answer for people who are aware of humans living all around a globe to how every eye will see him when he returns is, well, it'll be broadcast on television, right? How would the television stations miss this, right? It'll be on social media. Everyone's going to be live streaming it.
Yeah.
That's not found in the book of Acts explicitly, right? And so even in saying that, people think they're being literal, and yet they are introducing elements from their own worldview and their own context to fit the story into their own framework.
Right.
A book that was crucially important in my own faith journey helped me get away from saying, well, I'm still a Christian, I just don't take this that literally, to, you know what, you're not taking this as literally as you claim to be.
Right.
And if you're taking that literally, here's some other things you're not. And so, I don't need to pretend that you're being consistent while I apologize for everything that I, have had recognized the need to rethink in a modern context. But a key author was Keith Ward, and he really starts out one of his books that was very influential on me, What the Bible Really Teaches, he calls it, and why fundamentalists get it wrong is something like that is the footnote, or the subtitle. But he basically starts with, things like the Parousia, the return of Jesus. And if you're saying that it's still in the future, when, according to at least some of the New Testament authors, the impression we get is this generation will not pass away. So they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Right.
You're not taking that literally.
Right.
You're saying that generation did pass away and it's still in the future. You might say it's still soon, but that's one part of the language in the New Testament.
Right.
And so I think these things hang together, and together really illustrate the challenges of, but also the need to think seriously about what it means to be a Christian in the framework of a larger universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it's possible, and I believe it's meaningful, and that's how I understand myself. But I don't think we can just simply make a few adjustments, add a televised screening of the return, and then it all fits nicely together.
Right.
It takes some more serious, deeper rethinking of things than that, in my opinion.
Excellent. Let's get to the last and final question for this interview. Well, many of my students identify as Christian. Many others don't. I have all kinds of religious identities and non-religious identities in my classroom. So in your opinion, why is studying ancient texts like the Gospels or the Book of Acts and thinking about Christian doctrines like the Ascension valuable exercises? Are they valuable exercises for Christians only, or is there a reason that non-Christians or other religious expressions should have at least an academic interest in these topics that we've been discussing this morning?
Yes, I think that these things are worth being interested in for a number of reasons. If anyone's aware of the influence of that sort of end times, futuristic approach to Christianity, which I won't say too much about in detail because I gather that's another class period, but hopefully this will segue nicely into things that are still to come.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of consequences of that, right? If the end is near, then why invest in long-term? Why take an academic interest in anything, right? I mean, I remember, as a person contemplating, going to study these things.
Right.
If the Lord is coming back, why bother, right? But also, don't invest in, of course, on the one hand, the climate won't change unless God wants it to, but don't worry about the environment. It's like polishing the brass in the Titanic, right? The Earth is a sinking ship, right? And a lot of that reflects both a particular so-called literalism with regard to the ascension and return of Jesus in a particular way, but also, on the other hand, interestingly enough, that denigration of the material world as God's creation that is set not for simply destruction, but for new creation and of some sort of value. And so you have a sort of a crass physical literalism on the one hand, combined with an almost Gnostic denigration of the material world on the other. And, if that's literalism, I'm like, let's, maybe these different authors, didn't intend us to force all their stuff together in that kind of format. Maybe we're supposed to engage them in conversation and get some of their key points, which I think are at odds with some of the tenets of that. But I think just the very fact that we're talking about this at length, I'm guessing that if you have students, and if there's anyone else listening to this who is not intimately familiar, probably from the inside, with these Christian discussions and themes and ideas, they'll be like, initially the what, the who, the how, you're talking about what, and then by the end of this, hopefully say, wow, I had no idea.
Right.
And I think in every worldview, there are those things that are oftentimes simply taken for granted, but that make every conversation that depends on those things increasingly complicated as the world changes sometimes, but sometimes simply because we don't look at them. And so I think if only to engage in a comparative look at another tradition or one religious tradition if you don't have one yourself, and how ancient heritage, assumptions, views of the cosmos, all these things hang together to make a worldview, how they give expression to, or sometimes sit uncomfortably with our values, what's involved in rethinking values and how it requires maybe rethinking the universe and rethinking God and rethinking all kinds of things. Those are challenges that pretty much every tradition faces, whether they acknowledge it or not. And I think that some of the important lessons that we can learn that will be most helpful to us, we learn by comparing with others, seeing how they navigate those things that seem so strange to us, and then saying, wow, there are things that are strange in my own tradition as well. How will I navigate those? And what can I learn through that conversation?
That's a great point, great insights. And I'm excited that for my students to watch this video. It's always fun teaching a diverse classroom where you have people that have grown up around Christian traditions and they're having to rethink it, or they're saying, yeah, this is the way I've understood it. Now I'm getting a little more detail to it, to people who are going, like you said, what is any of this? This doesn't make any sense to me. It's brand new. And so I love teaching that. And I hope that my students have gotten at least some sense of why this is valuable and interesting to talk about from whatever perspective you're coming from, but also if there's words that they didn't quite understand or concepts that are totally brand new to them, that at least they'll get on Google and try to figure out what those things mean. Because if they're not important to you directly, they're still important to a lot of people in the world you live in, and you got to live in this world and get to know what your neighbors think and believe. So thank you so much for this conversation. We'll definitely have to get together and talk about the Mandaeans at some point, religion and sci-fi. Maybe we'll get more into the second coming in a different discussion, but if you're there, you go. It's over. It's over. The second coming. Super fun. All right. Thank you so much. And I will be posting this pretty soon to YouTube. So feel free to share, and I'll make sure my students get a chance to look at it next week.
Great. Thanks so much. Great talking to you.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.